So I'm back from a holiday in the south of the UK, or the south of England. I was in the New Forest for a week, which was declared a royal forest by William the Conqueror, so almost 1,000 years ago. And it is an extremely interesting and rare landscape here in the UK. I didn't take any video footage whilst I was down in the New Forest because it was a family holiday, but I did get some photos that I'm very pleased with. And it was my first time stalking and photographing deer. Rather curiously, I spent a lot of my time stalking fallow deer and didn't get any particularly good photos of those. But whilst doing that, I did accidentally stumble across a roe deer buck. And I'm extremely happy with this photograph. It's my favourite photograph of the year so far and one of my favourites I've ever taken. Partly because I don't get to photograph large mammals very often. Here in South Wales, we don't have many deer at all, if any. The roe deer, which is what this photo is of, doesn't really exist here at all, despite it being a native species, and that's likely due to it having been hunted very heavily beforehand. They're quite solitary creatures, and they're very interesting creatures, so I'm very pleased with this photograph because I captured him without him seeing me. I was waiting in a bush for about 2 hours, and it just came out really nice. It was a lovely morning. When I first got to the New Forest, I didn't really know how to explore it or how to find the animals in it because they live very much in the margins, and this was very much a lucky photograph, although I stumbled across the same buck about 2 hours later by chance because he'd presumably forgotten that I was around. But he hadn't seen me in this first photo, and I'm therefore very pleased with it. I feel like I got to experience something quite special, watching him, I presume, scent marking on the tree without him seeing me at all. So that came out good. But that week in the New Forest and the subsequent week, which we are now at the end of here in the UK, have been blazingly hot. It's been constant sunshine the entire time, which has been very nice. It makes a welcome change from the rain. But it has illustrated a problem with my current photography technique because the Z9 is the first full-frame camera I've had in quite a while. And even when I've had previous full-frame cameras, I've not been using them for the same purpose. In fact, I've only ever had one other full-frame camera after the film era. And even the film era doesn't really, or for me, never really had this same issue. And that's that I'm blowing the highlights out on a lot of the photographs I've been taking. I did notice this down in the New Forest, and I started using an alternative metering mode. But the vast majority of this problem is down to me, because I've spent so long using cameras that can take overexposure extremely well. It's very hard to blow the highlights on the OM1, for example. You can safely overexpose, and you should probably overexpose on the OM1 for a lot of wildlife photography in particular, because it's very noisy and loses colour detail in the shadows, but it maintains that detail in blown highlights really well. So on the OM1, I always shot with +1 EV, which was very effective on that camera for getting good exposures. And the same on the XH2S as well. I found it didn't mind being overexposed too much. There's somewhat of a technical reason for this, because when you've got smaller, more dense sensors, such as a 20-something megapixel micro four thirds sensor, is a very small sensor with a lot of pixels on it, so the pixels are very small, and this means that they're less receptive to light than larger pixels. But that has its benefit in that it's quite hard to overexpose them. I found in general on the OM1 that you could very safely overexpose. Even on my last full frame camera, which was a Canon 1DS Mark III that I picked up very cheap secondhand, Canon have an interesting feature that helps prevent you blowing the highlights. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but for a lot of their DSLRs, they have an option that basically protects the highlights to a certain degree. And it does actually work. I'm not entirely certain what they're doing there. But that isn't the case on the Nikon Z9. I haven't found a feature like that, and it's got a very sensitive sensor. It's a fantastic camera in low light, but it has the downside that it seems to be quite easy to blow the highlights. When I was down in the New Forest, I noticed this problem with my exposure for the first time. I was trying to photograph a kookaburra at a raptor centre, so an owl and raptor centre where they fly birds of prey. It's a brilliant place to go to tune your autofocus settings and just to play with your camera settings. And I was finding that in the very harsh sunlight of the past 2 weeks that the kookaburra was blowing out all the time. The highlights were just gone. And that's something you ideally want to avoid, particularly in bird photography. So I started experimenting with different metering modes and tried out the highlight-specific metering mode that the Nikon Z9 features, and I presume it's on other Nikon cameras, and it definitely exists on other cameras too. And in general, it works very well, but the problem I find with it is that it tends to change the exposure a lot. When you use evaluative metering, your viewfinder tends to change quite smoothly. This obviously was never a problem on DSLRs, but on mirrorless cameras where you're looking at a live exposure, it can be quite difficult to then follow subjects and things when it is exposed for a highlight that will probably never be underexposed and has plunged the rest of the photo into darkness. But I did find having the highlight-specific metering mode easily accessible very useful, and so in fact I've changed my custom button mapping on the Z9 so that function button 2 on the middle finger, I guess, or third finger on the right hand allows me to change my metering mode rather quickly so I can swap between it whilst shooting. I'm finding that quite an effective setup, but it does mean that I'm swapping between metering modes quite a lot based on whether it's an extremely contrasty scene. This cropped up again a couple of days ago. I tried to make a video on using this, the 85mm 1.8, which is a cracking lens and one of my favourite focal lengths, for some woodland photography just outside of Cardiff. And unfortunately, every photo I took on that day is terrible, partly because I'm not very good at woodland photography, and the other side of it is that even if I got a photo that I quite liked that had something interesting about it, I was still blowing the highlights massively. And I tried winding in and adding more exposure compensation, so I put it to -1 EV. That's not enough. -2 is probably closer, but with such strong contrast, you're always going to blow some of the highlights. Now, when I'm taking landscape photos, this is where I would use something like exposure stacking, and I would take a stack and merge them later just to protect that. But in moving areas like woodland with lots of trees moving and stuff like that, it's not really an option, and it's definitely not an option with wildlife. So yes, this hasn't been a tip video as such. It's just something to potentially keep in mind, and certainly something that I forgot about in the time since I last used a full-frame camera. As you change different sensor sizes in the gear that you use, your approach to highlights and shadows will have to change too. And where previously I have been tending to always shoot between a third of a stop and a stop overexposed on my cameras for wildlife photography, and then pulling it back in post, I'm now having to do the exact opposite. So I'm now negative a third of a stop, or down to negative a stop for most of my wildlife photography. But in weather like this, where the sunlight is extremely harsh and the contrast in your scene is very high if you have any amount of shadow, it's worth keeping in mind that you are going to have imperfect photographs. And particularly when it comes to things like wildlife, you're going to blow some of the highlights if you want to capture the scene effectively. Obviously, one solution to this is to get up earlier and to go out for sunrise or stay out later for sunset. Sunsets right now, great. Somewhere between 7:30 and 9 p.m. here. Don't mind that at all. However, sunrises are at 4:30 in the morning, and that requires a certain amount of dedication that I only show on rare occasions, such as for the roe deer photograph. But yes, summer is an awkward season for photography for me. We've got about another month or so until the heat haze starts for at least another month, and any photographs past 8 a.m. in the morning are effectively pointless. So at this time of year, it's about finding compromises and different ways to photograph. And if that involves photographing in shadier places like woodland, then that's good, but you do have to keep in mind that you are going to lose some of your highlights. Probably. So yes, thank you very much for watching. I'll have some other videos out fairly soon, especially as I've come to terms with the new camera and I'm starting to use it and explore it in different ways. I recently spent some time at Slimbridge Wetland Centre here in the UK, which is a brilliant place to go to tune your autofocus settings because there's so many flying birds around. I'll have some information out about what I've discovered so far in the near future. But to round out this video, here are some of my favourite photos of the past 2 weeks. As you'll notice in many of these, there are blown highlights. It's the nature of the weather and also me completely forgetting how to operate a camera properly. Until next time.